Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to talk about which of the new Patch 8 subclasses is the most fun. I'm going to go over each of these classes and talk about what I find fun about them and how fun I think they are. I did this for the previous subclasses and people really enjoyed it, so I thought it would be great to do for the new subclasses from Patch 8. Obviously, this is a subjective exercise. What I find fun and what you find fun might be different, and that's okay. But hopefully, talking about what's fun about each of these classes will help you find the fun in a class that maybe you previously would have overlooked. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to A. Bogan for the $2 donation, Sean Gallagher for the $20, Expulsive X for the $5, and It's Mazam X and Seth0110 for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Alright, let's have some fun. Now, I've already covered this in the previous installments of this tier list, but let me quickly just remind you what I find fun in a character and how I'm rating these characters within the different tiers. So what I look for in a subclass is I want to make a lot of interesting decisions throughout the game. I like it when a character enables me to do different things in different combats, and to make strategic decisions that feel impactful and relevant. I don't particularly care about having the most powerful character or the biggest numbers, although of course that helps a character do the thing that it's trying to do. I care more about whether that character can execute on the concept of the subclass in a way that's satisfying and fun. I like characters that change their gameplay over the course of a playthrough, and I like it when things can go wrong and force me to adapt to evolving situations. In S+ tier, I'm placing characters that fill all of these criteria. Their core gameplay is incredibly fun, and it evolves as you play. In S tier, I am placing characters whose core gameplay is really fun and who do well at filling the role that you want them for in your party, but maybe there are balance issues or the gameplay loop can become sort of samey over the course of a long playthrough that hold them back from being as satisfying for me to play as the characters in S+ tier, though these are still incredibly fun subclasses. In A tier, I'm placing characters that are still really fun, but maybe come with a drawback. Either there's a significant balance issue or an interface issue that makes them a little less fun than they should be, but the core gameplay loop is still really good. In B tier, I'm placing characters that are always solid and a good time, but maybe not standouts. You're gonna have a good time playing them, but maybe they won't be the character that you'll remember 10 years from now. And in C tier, I'm placing characters with a significant issue with their gameplay that holds me back from having as much fun with the character as I feel I should. I've decided to rate the 12 new subclasses in isolation to avoid visual clutter from the old tier list, but I will combine them into the old tier list at the end of the video, and also make a couple adjustments to some subclasses who have gotten more fun with the launch of Patch 8 because of having new options, so I'm going to move a couple classes around at the end. And other than that, let's just get right into it. We're going to start with Path of the Giant's Barbarian, which is a subclass that I have somewhat mixed feelings about because it is so incredibly cool. Raging and becoming enormous is just conceptually really cool. Boot of the Giant's kicking enemies around the battlefield is great, and infusing your weapon with elemental damage and then hurling it at your enemies is just a really fun and satisfying idea for a class. On the other hand, it runs into some of the mechanical issues with some of the systems that it uses in Baldur's Gate 3, which are pretty prevalent across a lot of characters. So Giant's Barbarian is a character that's really, really cool, but because of some mechanical oddities, I think isn't quite as fun to play as it maybe should be. Let's start with the good stuff. Boot of the Giants is just one of the most fun and most satisfying abilities in the game. A bonus action to just kick an enemy across the battlefield is just so fun. Being able to reposition enemies is always great. And Boot of the Giants is one of the best ways to do that. It lets you use your athletics to just kick an enemy in the face and send them flying, which is exactly the feeling that you want to evoke when you're playing a character like a Path of the Giants Barbarian. You want to get huge and you want to punt enemies around. Growing when you rage is awesome. Getting bigger is just funny visually and makes you feel really cool. And you can combine it with other effects that increase your size to make a gigantic owl bear and stuff like that, which is just really fun. Keep an eye out for a build based around that as well. On the other hand, Path of the Giants Barbarian is a little bit weird in Baldur's Gate 3 because it is a throwing-focused Barbarian subclass, and we already had one of those in Berserker Barbarian, and throwing in Baldur's Gate 3 is implemented in a kind of janky way that's a little irritating to use. Firstly, it requires multiple clicks every time you want to attack, because you have to select throw and then select the thing that you're going to throw, which is just annoying as an interface design choice. I really wish there was a way to quick cast throw so that you could do it in only one button. And secondly, you're often going to be trying to draw line of sight when you're throwing a weapon because it throws in an arc through a low ceilinged area or something, and getting the can't draw path to target message over and over and over again, which is just frustrating to do. Combine that with the fact that that throwing in Baldur's Gate has significant balance issues because of their house rule for Tavern Brawler, meaning that throwing characters basically can't miss their attacks and do way, way more damage than they should, which is compounded for Giants Barbarian because on Tactician mode and below it's bugged and applies the damage riders multiple times over, so it does even more damage than it's supposed to. And you get a character that ends up just doing too much damage and one-shotting enemies with no chance for missing or anything like that, so you don't get to play the game as much when you are playing a throwing character. On the other hand, being able to use Elemental Cleaver to apply elemental effects at range by throwing a weapon is just awesome. Having your greatsword crackling with lightning and then gaining lightning charges as you throw it is just a really cool phenomenon. And being able to use Encrusted with Frost, as in the Giant Barbarian build that I presented, to freeze enemies by hitting them over and over again with your weapons at range until they become frozen, that's just great. There's a lot of stuff to really love about this class, but the janky mechanics definitely have some issues. I will also say there's something that I'm a little bit disappointed by, which is that one of the cool things about Giant Barbarian should be throwing weapons that normally aren't throwing weapons, because you can use Elemental Cleaver to give them throwing and returning. And that it should be really cool, letting you use weapons with cool magical effects and throw them at enemies. But unfortunately, it doesn't work in Baldur's Gate, because in BG3, unless a weapon specifically applies its effect when thrown, throwing a weapon never applies the magical effect of that weapon. So you can't do cool things with Giant Barbarian, like hurl the Susur Greatsword at Mage and silence them from across the map by impaling them with a giant sword. I think that is kind of a miss, because that's one of the things that would be so cool about including this class that can throw weapons that normally can't be thrown. And unfortunately, in practice, you end up using the same, 5 throwing weapons that you've been using with every throwing character since Baldur's Gate 3 launched. I really like Giants Barbarian. I think that it is a very fun class. I think it's conceptually really cool, and I think it is fun to play, but I really wanted to love it, and I think that it is missing just a few things that would make it incredibly mechanically satisfying, and there's some interface and balance issues with throwing characters in general in Baldur's Gate 3 that unfortunately hold this character back a little bit. I'm going to give it A tier because it's really fun, especially if you play off-meta builds and don't lean into the throwing stuff as much, but it doesn't quite land as the core class fantasy that I wanted it to have. Next up, Glamour Bard. So this is probably the most controversial class in patch 8. You either love it or you hate it. There's a lot of people who think that it's terrible from a mechanical standpoint, and they're wrong, but it is a pure support class, so you have to be aware that that's what you're getting into when you're playing a Glamour Bard. I think that this class is at its best in a multiplayer environment, actually, because you can play support for your friends, especially if they're a little less experienced with Baldur's Gate 3, and enable them to do really cool things while helping them along without stealing the glory, so that your friends or partners or parents or young children or whatever can do all of the things that they think are coolest, and you can help them along. Glamour Bard lets you do a lot of really interesting stuff in combat. The ability to use Mantle of Inspiration to charm enemies without a saving throw is really cool, and enables you to do a lot of really fun moves where you move an ally next to an enemy and deliberately provoke an attack of opportunity or redirect enemy aggro in order to get that charm effect so that you can land a no-save debuff with Mantle of Majesty. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of no-save debuffs in Baldur's Gate. I think that anything that bypasses enemies' normal hit chance or saving throw tends to not be fun, because it tends to mean that you don't interact with the fight in a meaningful way. And that's definitely a risk with Glamour Bard. Enemies that can be charmed and commanded, you can charm without a saving throw. They just have to hit one of your inspiration allies, and command without a saving throw. And once you've done that, the fight's over with no interaction from the enemies at all, which is definitely a downside. On the positive side, it's a little bit of a riskier strategy, because it is Mantle of Majesty is concentration, so you can lose it. And Mantle of Inspiration requires your ally to get hit, so you are at least engaging with the enemies insofar as they have to make attacks. But that definitely, if you are using this character optimally, you're going to interact with the game a little bit less. Bards at base, of course, are just really fun. Having all of the skills is great. Being able to support your allies is incredible. Bard spell list is really fun and enables a lot of creative gameplay. And I think that the tactical puzzle that Glamour Bard gives you is always going to be a really interesting one from fight to fight. Although it will tend to look quite similar between fights, and a lot of the time what you're doing is bypassing the most interesting boss fights in the game by completely turning them off without a saving throw with Mantle of Majesty. As a result, I'm going to give Glamour Bard S tier for fun. I think that it is a really fun character, but the downside of Mantle of Majesty not having a saving throw and ending fights instantly does mean that you will sometimes run into fights that are less fun than they should be, because Glamour Bard just locks down the main enemy in that fight in a way that's not terribly interactive. Next up, Death Clerics. So I love Death Clerics. I think that this is a great class, well implemented in Baldur's Gate 3. The main downside of playing a Cleric is that often in combat you won't have a thing that's good to do on your turn, and you'll have to sort of settle for an action that feels a little bit bad, something like a Sacred Flame that has a good chance of missing. Obviously there's all the Shadowheart memes with missing Sacred Flames all the time. That's because often it's not the right move, but it's sort of the only thing that you have because you've spent your spells for that combat, and Clerics by default just don't have great actions. Death Cleric fixes that problem because you always have the option of double casting a great cantrip in the form of Toll the Dead or Bone Chill, and that's always a really relevant thing to do. So when you don't have something more exciting to do, you're still contributing, which means that there's no turns where you just feel useless or like you're not doing anything in combat with that character. Death Domain Clerics also have Touch of Death, the Channel Divinity spell, which allows you to have huge burst damage, and that's just satisfying. An enemy getting too close to your cleric and just getting melted by an Inflict Wounds with Touch of Death just feels really good. It doesn't happen every turn, so it doesn't become monotonous, but every time it happens, it just feels so funny and so satisfying that it's really nice to be able to do that. There are a couple downsides to Death Cleric. Their domain spell list is pretty weak, and so doesn't add a lot of variety to their gameplay compared to just normal Cleric spells, but normal Cleric spells are plenty to have fun with and have different tools for lots of different combats. And there is one minor interface issue for Death Clerics, which is that Divine Strike and Touch of Death both use the reactions menu, even though neither of them is actually a reaction, and so you can't use them both on the same turn, even though you should be, or in the same attack, even though you should be able to, which is kind of annoying. That's not a big deal, but it is a minor downside of the class. It also falls, I think, at a very good power level, Death Clerics, because they're a little bit weaker than Light, Tempest, or Nature Clerics, which are probably a little bit on the too powerful side, but stronger than the other Clerics, so they fall at a really great point for balance, where they feel like a strong class that contributes really well to your party, but doesn't break encounters entirely on its own. Overall, I think Death Cleric is an incredibly successful and fun class to play. You get to be, a necrotic goth running around, very flavorful for Shadowheart as well, and the class does a great job of implementing the power fantasy for Death Cleric. S+ tier. Star Druids. So Star Druids, I've said before, are like Druids, but more so. And Druids are great. Star Druids do everything that you want from a Druid, but add the starry forms, which let you choose a mode, which you can swap whenever you spend a wild shape charge, in order to have a little bit of a bonus effect. Druids are already, in my opinion, an incredibly fun class with a lot of varied tools that could fill pretty much any role in a party. They have great spell versatility and combat versatility and are very powerful without usually being so broken that they just ruin the game entirely. And Star Druid continues that theme by giving you even more emphasis on cool things that you can do. Which story form you pick is a meaningful decision that you're going to change at different points in the game and for different encounters. And when you level up and get the higher level story forms, it becomes really fun because you can freely cycle between them once per turn. So chaining the pattern through to make sure you're always in the story form that you want in order to maximize your abilities becomes a really interesting puzzle. Star Druids also get Guiding Bolt, free casts of Guiding Bolt, which is a great spell for a Druid to have. Single target direct damage isn't something Druids normally get, so it gives you another tool in your arsenal, letting you be a real jack-of-all-trades character. And they also get an analog of Lore Bard's Cutting Words with their omens, as they level up, and Cutting Words is probably the single most fun ability in the game because being able to change die rolls as a reaction is just really cool, so the fact that Star Druids get to do that as well is awesome. I think that the one downside of Star Druids is just that they do so many things so well that they can sort of eat the role of other characters in your party, but because their abilities are so unique and varied and interesting, there's always going to be a place for a Star Druid in your party that you can fill with other characters also getting to shine, and so I think Star Druids are just a phenomenally successful class. I basically have no complaints about Star Druid, and think that they're an incredibly fun character to play, S+. The Arcane Archer. So Arcane Archer is conceptually incredibly cool. Firstly, Magical Archer is a lot of people's just like favorite type of character to exist in a fantasy game. And I think that the power fantasy of a Magical Archer is just a really cool thing and something that doesn't really otherwise show up in Dungeons and Dragons. So having Arcane Archers exist, lets a type of character that previously wasn't available be played, which in and of itself is very cool. I also think that Arcane Archer's design in Baldur's Gate works really well. There's 8 different Arcane Archer arrows, and all 8 of those arrows are balanced and fun and interesting with one another, so you can build an Arcane Archer in a lot of different ways and have a character that's quite unique from the previous way that you built Arcane Archer. Which arrows you take is actually a meaningful decision as you level up, and which one do you use in combat is also, at least sometimes, a pretty meaningful decision as well, because the different arrows have a lot of different efficiencies in different situations, so you are going to change what you're doing depending on the scenario. That's especially true when you combine it with the magical arrows that exist in the game to give you even more options. So Arcane Archer can often have very different effects while also dishing out great damage, so you get to put up great numbers as well as doing really cool things with your archery arrows. The one downside there is that unfortunately you can't use the magical arrows and your Arcane Archer abilities in the same shot. And it does feel a little bit like a flavor failure for the Magical Archer not to be able to use the magical arrows. Not being able to infuse a magical arrow with your own magic does feel like it does kind of take away from the power fantasy of the class to do all of these cool things at the same time. But in practice, you're going to end up using them often in different situations anyways, so you will still get to make really cool and interesting decisions using the magical arrows available. There are, I think, 2 other things that are issues with Arcane Archer, and that is that they are just a little bit too stable. The resource that you use to fire your arrows is so abundant that you don't really have to consider resource management. And the impact of firing your arrows, both in terms of the damage output that they do and the effects that they have, is very high and present in every combat, so Arcane Archers can tend to be a little bit oppressive in terms of turning every fight into the Arcane Archer Fest. They also basically can't die because they're a fighter, and being a fighter who fights at range and uses dexterity and all of that means that you have super high armor class, you're a fighter, so you've got really good hit points, and you're playing at long range, so Arcane Archers are rarely going to ever feel threatened during a game, which does reduce some of the drama. The other main issue with Arcane Archer is Banishing Arrow. Banishing Arrow is a balance problem. It is way, way too good because it simply removes enemies from combat. Banishment as a 4th level spell is already a great spell. Banishment as something that takes half, or in the late game, a third of an action, and also does a bunch of damage at the same time and is almost resource free because you get so many arcane shots over the course of an adventuring day, just obviates a lot of encounters. So many encounters when you have Banishing Arrow on an Arcane Archer are just going to be the Archer banishes half the enemies and then kills the other half, and enemies will never get a turn because they're going to be either dead or banished by the time their turn rolls around. So you never have to really react to what the enemies are doing. That said, aside from that one balance issue, all of the arrows I think are really, really fun to use, and Banishing Arrow, if you use it a little bit more sparingly, is also a really fun ability. It's just that it can start to take over combats because it is so powerful. So I'm going to give Arcane Archer S tier because I think that it is just a super fun class, very successful at the power fantasy that it is portraying for the player, and aside from one small balance issue with one ability, I think implemented extremely well in Baldur's Gate. Next up, Drunken Master Monk. Oh boy. Okay, so I spent a lot of time during the stress test and the beta talking about how this class needed a significant rework before launch. It got a lot of changes, and those changes were for the better, but to be honest, they just didn't go far enough. Astute viewers of the channel will have noticed that I've done a class guide for every one of these new subclasses, except for Drunken Master Monk, and I'm still working on that one, but I haven't really found a great way to build this character that doesn't end up just feeling like a discount open-hand monk, because they do very similar things, but the Drunken Master Monk does everything significantly worse. This character, or this subclass, has a lot of design issues and sort of self-defeating choices where its abilities are at war with itself that make it feel very just awkward to play. It definitely has some good points and there's some fun things about it, but there's just enough issues with this subclass that it's really hard to recommend. I'm going to actually tab over to the wiki and talk through kind of the issues with the subclass point by point, because I think it's worth going through some of the things about this subclass that are a little bit frustrating. So let's start right at the beginning with Cheeky Tipple, which seems like a pretty cool ability. Makes you immune to the negative effects of being drunk, great for a drunken master, and restores your key points. A lot of monk subclasses have ways to restore key points. This one being tied to alcohol seems pretty cool. However, there's a weirdness with how this is implemented in Baldur's Gate 3 that is kind of irritating, which is that this is just a passive, and it triggers the first time you drink alcohol during a day with no way to control it. And so the first time you drink during an adventuring day, you're going to use this once per day ability to restore key points. That means that your Drunken Master Monk can't drink alcohol or they waste their ability, and the natural gear choice for this character, the drunken gear, is in some ways at its worst on the Drunken Master Monk because using it costs you a pretty important ability. This is weird and kind of didn't have to be this way. It would be so easy for this to be an activated ability that consumed an alcohol in your inventory rather than triggering passively. Just a strange choice to make that interface mean that you can't otherwise drink. Drunken Performance is fine. This is a flavor ability. It's great. Drunken Technique is also a really cool ability. This is the first one that really does what it's supposed to do, where you replace your normal flurry of blows with one that gives you extra movement speed and disengage. That's a really fun ability. It plays into the sort of hit and run playstyle that this character is supposed to have. The main challenge with this ability is that it is kind of a discount version of what Open Hand Monk gets, because Open Hand Monk gets the ability to knock enemies prone or backwards with their flurry of blows, which does the same thing, because it's going to remove the enemy from being able to opportunity attack you anyways. So Drunken Master Monk just gets kind of a worse version of Open Hand Monk's abilities. That in and of itself isn't a deal breaker, obviously, and this ability is still fun to use, but it does feel a little bad, especially because as both unarmed damage-focused monks, there's kind of a natural comparison there. At level 4, you get Intoxicating Strike, which by itself doesn't do anything. You hit an enemy, spend a key point, and get them drunk. But that also triggers Life of the Party, which they did move to level 4. In the beta, this was at level 7, which meant that at level 4, you got an ability that did actually nothing for 3 levels. So I'm really glad they moved this. And Life of the Party gives you an extra stack of Life of the Party, which gives you +1 armor class and +1 to your attack rolls against drunk targets until you are attacked or until combat ends. The fact that this buff goes away when enemies attack you, whether they hit or miss, is really annoying, because there are some ways to control enemy aggro in Baldur's Gate 3, but not a ton, and this will also randomly drop when enemies use AoE abilities and stuff, so Life of the Party as a defensive ability is not that reliable, and for something not that reliable, it's also really not that impactful. 1 AC and 1 bonus to attack rolls is just not that exciting, because definitionally, you've already hit the enemy to get them drunk, which means that you can hit them, so the attack roll benefit is not as powerful. And 1 AC is just not that good. This also comes with another problem, which is that you can stack it infinitely outside of combat, which sort of breaks the game. So there's even more weird issues with this ability, aside from it mostly just not doing that much. Leap to your feet is cool, but doesn't always work properly in Baldur's Gate 3 because it doesn't work when enemies hit you with a prone ability that lasts for multiple turns. Redirect attack is actually quite cool. You spend a key point to make a reaction when an enemy misses you. It stacks with Life of the Party, so this is the first ability that has some synergy. It's an unarmed attack, so it encourages you to use Tavern Brawler, which of course has some balance issues, but Redirect attack is, I would say, the first Drunken Master Monk ability that's actually fun and cool to use. Sobering Realization you can pretty safely ignore. It does bonus psychic damage, but again, costs you Life of the Party, which is already something that is really, really easy to lose, and sobers up your enemy, so it costs you a bunch of key points for a very small amount of damage. Much better to spend those key points on stunning strikes or flurries, so you usually won't use this ability. And then Drunkard's Luck is a totally fine ability, although a little bit lackluster as a level 11 capstone. For the most part, this class just has a lot of abilities that fight against themselves. So it ends up in practice playing out where you just use Drunken Technique to disengage and you just do your punches, and occasionally you get a redirect attack punch, but mostly you're just playing an open hand monk with without the open hand monk abilities and with no real abilities from Drunken Master. I really feel like this character just needs a redesign. Now, obviously, the base mechanics of Monk are still very fun, and running around and punching things is just a great time, so you can still definitely have fun with this character, and I really don't mean to yuck anyone's yum here. If you're enjoying your Drunken Master Monk, great, and please let me know what you think is so fun about it, because I would love to find the fun for this subclass. It's very possible that I'm just missing something that makes it fun in a way that I hadn't considered. As is, though, unfortunately, I haven't really been able to find a role for this class that makes it enjoyable to play for me, so I'm going to give it C tier. Oath of the Crown Paladin. So Oath of the Crown Paladin gets to be a Radiant Warrior of Justice, which is just a cool class fantasy, and it fills that very well. It's nice that you get to be a more support-oriented paladin with healing and taunting abilities and to tank for your allies, and it's nice that you get to use the radiating orb gear and effects that care about radiant damage because you get to be a paladin who has spirit guardians, so you get to use all of the radiant stuff that often is reserved for clerics as a paladin, which just is both very fun and very powerful, and a thing that this character gets to do in a sort of unique way. There are a couple things that I am not a huge fan of with Oath of the Crown Paladin, and some of these people have definitely run into, which is that it is very easy to accidentally break your oath on this character, because just like with every other paladin, there are dialogue choices that will break your oath, and for Oath of the Crown Paladin, breaking promises breaks your oath, and what the game considers a promise is not always 100% clear. I've said previously that I don't like that in Baldur's Gate 3 you can accidentally break your oath, because that should be a decision that your character, who's devoted their entire life and purpose to this creed makes only with moment and weight and consequence. That should be the climax of their story, is making a decision that they find so morally important that they have to violate this magical pact that they've devoted their entire life for. It shouldn't be something that happens by accident or due to a misclick, and it's very easy for that to happen, especially with Oath of the Crown Paladin, and that just feels weird, and like it always breaks my immersion whenever something like that happens. And definitely this is something that can happen even more frequently with Oath of the Crown than with other oaths. There's also a mechanical issue with Oath of the Crown Paladin, which is the level 7 ability Divine Allegiance, which does radiant damage to your own character. So if you're using the Radiating Orb abilities, you're going to debuff yourself, which is just a weird way to implement that ability. And I think it would be better in general if they had just kept the tabletop implementation where you just redirect the attack from an ally to yourself, rather than doing this thing where it heals the ally and then damages you based on your paladin level, which is a significant house rule from the tabletop version of the class. Those two quibbles aside, though, Oath of the Crown Paladin, I think, is just really fun. You do a lot of damage, you've got great controlling tools, and being a paladin running around with spirit guardians and smiting enemies is great. It's going to be kind of the same thing from fight to fight, but that thing is just really fun to do. Overall, I'm going to give it A tier because I think that it tends to feel a little samey to me, and there are a couple things that hold it back, but it is still just a pretty fun character that I really enjoy playing. Swarmkeeper Ranger. So this is exactly the type of class that I really want to like. It has 3 different swarms, each of which has 3 different abilities, which sounds like a lot of choice. But unfortunately, because you only choose your swarm when you level up, and those 3 abilities are the same across different swarms, some of them don't work because of some kind of mechanical issues, you're going to end up doing the same thing pretty much every turn in combat. Now, that thing is very fun, especially if you choose Bee's swarm. Then punting enemies around the battlefield by pushing enemies backwards with the swarm of bees is great. And anytime you can reposition enemies, it lets you feel clever, it lets you do interesting things, and it lets you have a lot of fun. Swarmkeeper Ranger also lets you play a debuffing archer, which is kind of a cool archetype that normally doesn't exist in Baldur's Gate 3, although I think that for most players, if you want to do that, Arcane Archer does the same thing, but with more optionality and more powerful debuffs as well. Swarmkeeper Ranger also has a couple other issues, which is that the Moth's Swarm, which should be the most powerful of them, blinding enemies, doesn't work in Baldur's Gate 3 because of the way that effect durations work in Baldur's Gate. Enemies lose blind duration at the beginning of their turn. So when you blind an enemy for 1 turn, as you do with moths, they become unblinded right at the beginning of their turn, which is pretty frustrating because you don't actually get the debuff that this character is supposed to provide, which obviously is both much less powerful and also just much less fun. And I think a lot of people, myself included, used that ability thinking it was going to be cool, ran into that and went, what? Really? And then decided that we're just not going to use that swarm anymore because it was very frustrating. It also kind of doubles up on the ranger problem in general, which is that rangers don't really get any new abilities from level 3 to level 11. So your character at level 10 is exactly as strong and as interesting as they were at level 5 when they got extra attack, which of course every martial character gets. So you really don't change that much over the course of the 12 levels. Your capstone ability is really fun. Getting slow on every arrow, or getting to knock enemies prone and push them around is great. Anytime you can reposition enemies is great and really fun. So I really do enjoy Bee's Swarm, even if it's not the mechanically most powerful of the swarms. But Swarmkeeper Ranger, I feel like, just plays the same over the 12 levels. And while it's always going to be fun to play, it rarely stands out to me. I'm going to give it B tier for the Bee Swarm. Swashbuckler Rogue. So Swashbuckler Rogue, similar to Swarmkeeper Ranger, gets 3 main abilities, but these 3 main abilities you can use all at once, and so you're going to change which you're using from turn to turn. They just take a bonus action, and you can disarm an enemy, blind an enemy, or cast Vicious Mockery. Typically, disarming or blinding an enemy is going to be the way to go, and the the Swashbuckler passives let you set up really cool in-combat scenarios. Swashbuckler rogues get to sneak attack isolated targets. They get to hit and run enemies because they get automatic disengage against enemies that they attack. They get to disarm enemies. They're rogues with effectively extra attack because you get an attack as a bonus action. And rogues have such a huge bag of tricks already that it was really just the relatively lower power level of rogues that made them a little bit less fun to play. Swashbuckler Rogue, by virtue of being a little bit stronger than the default rogue chassis, brings them up to an appropriate balance point and makes them an incredibly fun character. Swashbuckler also multi-classes really well. 4 levels of Swashbuckler Rogue works really well with a lot of other builds, and is a great monoclass character, unlike most other rogues, so you can do either. It doesn't get a lot of abilities past level 4, but Panache at level 9 is also really fun to use, and the core gameplay loop of Swashbuckler is so fun, and changes so much over the course of the game just based on the equipment that you have, and the enemies that you're facing, and the buffs that you have from your party, that I think actually not getting many new abilities from the class mostly doesn't matter, because the way that this character plays out in practice really changes over the course of a playthrough, and really makes you think through what you're doing. I think this character succeeds admirably at the core fantasy of a swashbuckler, a character who is using their panache and style to dance around the battlefield and clown on their enemies. And also, from a mechanical standpoint, you're just making a lot of really interesting decisions every turn. So I think this character is one of my favorite martial characters in general, and a character that's just overall really, really fun to play. This is the play pattern that I really wish Drunken Master Monk had succeeded in creating, where you're doing cool things, running around the battlefield and positioning yourself so enemies can't retaliate, picking off isolated foes, and using your slippery nature to get away so you can act unpredictably. I think that this character is just excellent and always a blast to play. S+ tier. Shadow Sorcerer. So Shadow Sorcerer is a super cool class. It's similar to Star Druid in that it's like Sorcerer, but more so. So it's great as just a default Sorcerer. But it also gives you a lot of the darkness synergy that's such a powerful strategy in Baldur's Gate 3. The Hound that you get at level 6 is really fun, and while summons can sometimes be a little bit irritating to control in BG3, the fact that this one is resummonable just costs you 3 sorcery points, so if it dies it's not that big a deal, although it will make you feel sad. Does mean that this one suffers a lot less from some of the issues that can plague summons, with the positioning just being time consuming and requiring a lot more effort from the player. Because this one's so cheap to summon, you can afford to be a little bit more careless with where you put Nimbus. I also really like the mini game with the omens. When Nimbus bites an enemy, he places an omen on that character, and then if you do the appropriate damage type, either with the sorcerer or with someone else in your party, you regain a sorcery point. And arranging your party so that you have every damage type available and convenient so that you can regain resources in combat is just a really fun minigame. It doesn't come up as often as I would like because the save DC on the omens is really low, so you have to kind of buff Nimbus with some effects in order to make that more likely to happen. But it is still a really fun minigame to play when it comes up. And at level 11, Shadow Sorcerer gets to teleport freely to any area of darkness, which of course is awesome when Shadow Monk gets to do it, and just as awesome when Shadow Sorcerer gets to do it, and feels like a really powerful and meaningful capstone. So getting to level 11 and unlocking this ability just feels great. The one downside of Shadow Sorcerer is just power level. Sorcerers are already extremely powerful in Baldur's Gate 3, and Darkness is one of the most abusive strategies in the game, entirely turning off some classes of encounter. So a sorcerer that both abuses Darkness and also just is a sorcerer and gets a really great summon and free teleports is just a little bit too high on the power level side. They also suffer a little from a very narrow spell selection, so unless you multiclass with Wizard or something like that to get extra spells, you will end up spamming the same few very powerful spells over and over again because you just don't have that many spells available as a Shadow Sorcerer. So while I really love this class's core gameplay, I do feel like it can sometimes get a little bit repetitive and it's a little bit too powerful, but I'm still going to give them S tier because Shadow Sorcerers are just a really, really fun character to play, just a little bit high on the power level scale for my taste. The Hexblade Warlock. Alright, so we're going from a character that's a little bit too high on the power level scale to a character that's a lot too high on the power level scale. Hexblade Warlocks are awesome. They're a really fun character that can do so many different things and enable so many cool builds. Getting charisma-based attacks on other characters makes them a really awesome multi-classing option, and they let all kinds of characters have access to weapon attacks that normally wouldn't otherwise. But it has to be said, Hexblade Warlocks are broken. This character is just so absurdly powerful, and it can do everything so incredibly well that it really eats the roles of a lot of other characters in your party. In fact, the main issue with Hexblade Warlock, it's sort of like the opposite of Glamour Bard, where it's really at its worst in a multiplayer environment. Because the main issue with Hexblade isn't that you won't have fun playing the Hexblade, it's that every other character in your party is going to feel worse just because the Hexblade is there. And so that can end up really being oppressive or making your experience playing with a party overall a little bit worse, because the Hexblade ends up just doing everything. This character does so much damage, has such great crowd control, and has such powerful abilities with darkness and such great defensive abilities that it is just incredibly powerful. But it is also true that what it's doing is really, really fun. Having amazing damage output, playing a character that can do both martial and spellcasting stuff, and being able to control the battlefield with your extremely powerful spells, getting the free summons that just spawn across the battlefield and cause chaos, all of these things are incredibly fun. It's just that Hexblade is extremely powerful. The best thing about this character, honestly, is how many different builds it enables, where you are able to build a class that normally wouldn't be able to use melee attacks effectively, like a Sorcerer, suddenly can become an incredibly potent melee character with only a single level of Hexblade Warlock. It also lets you build charisma-based paladins, charisma-based sword bards, and all kinds of other really cool builds, just by the existence of this character. And while it is true that it makes a lot of builds feel a little bit weird because there's just no reason not to take one level of Hexblade for most builds, for most melee builds, the depth of builds that it enables just by existing is really cool. Playing a monoclass Hexblade Warlock is also just super fun, and sometimes you just want to play a super powerful character. So I'm going to give Hexblade Warlock S tier. I think that it is way over the power scale and definitely could use some scaling back in terms of its numbers and just the sheer variety of things that it does better than any other character. But being able to do everything really well is also really fun. And finally, Bladesinging Wizard. So the Bladesinging Wizard is a melee caster, just like that Hexblade, but it's a little bit lower on the overall power scale, and because it's a wizard, tends to have more varied spell access, so we'll be making more different decisions as to what spells it's casting. The Bladesong Climax ability, aside from just having a very funny name, which I obviously like to say as many times as possible, is really fun to build around. Building up Bladesong Climax charges and then unleashing them in the largest possible climax is a really interesting tactical puzzle to play through, and making sure that you're using your spells and attacks efficiently in order to get the most out of your climax is the thing that makes this character fun to play. It's also a wizard, which is always just going to be fun because wizards have the largest list of spells in the game, so they have the most options for doing different and interesting things in combat. There's a couple things that are a little bit weird about Bladesinging Wizard. The first is that it is a resource-based class, and you start with only 2 uses of Bladesong, which means that you are often not going to be able to use your core class feature in a fight, or are going to have to rest pretty frequently in the early levels. It's very similar to Barbarians, who also only start with 2 rages. However, unlike Barbarians, when you aren't Bladesinging, you are still a wizard, so you still have really fun things to do and lots of different choices to make, whereas when a Barbarian's not raging, you're just a Barbarian with worse numbers, which just feels bad. A Bladesinging Wizard without Bladesong is still a completely respectable character. The other thing is that often the right way to play this character is just to cast spells and sort of ignore the melee combat aspect of Bladesinging Wizard, or to abuse Shadowblade, which is a real balance problem. The balance issue with Bladesinging Wizard is that they get access to Shadowblade and extra attack, and Shadowblade combos with the Resonance Stone to double the damage that it does, meaning that it's very easy to build this character to wildly overpower encounters by doing way too much damage. So I actually find this character much more fun if you don't use the Shadowblade Resonant Stone combo, because then you just kill everything in a couple swings, and it kind of removes the purpose of the character. So I've had actually a lot more fun using weapons like the Duelist Prerogative, or things like that, in order to get multiple counter spells and really feel more like a spellcasting wizard, and less like a character that just uses haste and hits many, many times over for maximum damage with the Shadowblade. Other than Shadowblade being a little bit broken, though, there's just no downsides to Bladesinger Wizard. I think that this is a really fun character. Wizards are already great, and it does a good job of making you feel like a sword wizard dancing around the battlefield, using your sword and then bursting enemies down with an incredible burst of climactic magic. S+ tier for the Bladesinging Wizard. So here you can see the overall list for the patch 8 subclasses, and I think overall they did a really good job with these subclasses. There's a lot of S+ and S tier classes, and I think overall these subclasses are incredibly fun to play, and I really have enjoyed building and playing with them. Swashbuckler Rogue is especially awesome to me because it's a martial character with so many decision points, so it's sort of like playing all the solidity and power of a martial character and the decision making of a spellcaster, so you really get the best of both worlds, which I think is a really incredible design. A couple classes that didn't quite hit the mark for me, but overall I think a really good job with the patch 8 subclasses. And finally, I mentioned also that I would integrate the patch 8 subclasses into the overall tier list that I put together in the last 3 videos. So here it is, and I have a couple changes to make, because the launch of patch 8 did make some significant updates to some of the older classes, so I think they're worth revisiting because they've gotten more fun. 2 in particular have benefited from the addition of a spell in patch 8, and those are Eldritch Knight. Yes, this is the Eldritch Knight icon. There's a bug in-game where it swaps the Battlemaster, which is the flag, and the Eldritch Knight, which is the flame icons, but this one's the Eldritch Knight icon. And I put Eldritch Knight in B tier because it didn't really feel like a magical fighter to me. Well, they've added Booming Blade as a cantrip, which goes a really long way towards making Eldritch Knight feel like a magical fighter. And you can also use Shadowblade with them, where summoning a magical sword also helps fill that class fantasy. On the other hand, of course, they have become extremely overpowered as a result of Booming Blade, so I'm going to bump them up 1 tier to A tier. And very similarly, I'm also going to move Arcane Trickster Rogue, which again didn't feel as much like a spellcaster or a spellcasting rogue, and also suffered from just being fairly weak from a balance perspective in general. The existence of Booming Blade has both made this class much, much stronger, and also made it feel much more like a rogue that's actually using magic in order to do roguey things. So I'm going to bump Arcane Trickster Rogue up by 1 tier to S tier as well. I also want to mention that the existence of Toll the Dead has made a lot of Cleric subclasses feel better to play. I don't think it's enough to move any of them in tiers, but Cleric subclasses, as I mentioned, Clerics often had the problem of sometimes just having dead turns where it didn't feel like there was anything good for you to do. Adding Toll the Dead to Clerics has removed that issue, so in play, you're going to feel better about playing them a lot of the time, which just makes Clerics overall even more fun than they already were. So let me move the mouse off the screen here so you can get a clean screenshot if that's something that you're looking for. I know many people appreciate that. And of course, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the patch 8 subclasses and how fun I think they are. And if you think that there's something that I'm missing about one of these characters that makes it fun in a way that I hadn't considered, please definitely let me know in the comments. I'm open to suggestions, and I'm always interested in hearing what other people find fun, because maybe I too will find it fun and enjoy it for myself, or be able to pass that enjoyment on to other people. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like button and leave a comment. It helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I really appreciate when you take the time to do that. It really does help out. It's the best way to help creators if you enjoy their work. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 videos and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.